The Barnbow Lasses, Part 2. Jazz ran home as fast as she could, away from the flames and screams and the stench of smoke. She stumbled over rocks and ignored the greetings of other dog waters that she usually said hello to. She was in shock. People even called out to her. Was she okay? Jazz blanked them, trying to process what had just happened. What she had seen on the fields in what seemed like a bomb site was appalling. The screams, the smell of burning, women staggering from the buildings covered in blood and soot, and then the girl Edith asking her for more help. Had it been real? The other dog walkers had seemed to see nothing. Back home, still not even 7 a.m, Jazz grabbed her mum's laptop and keyed Barnbow Lasses into Google. That's what Edith had called them, wasn't it? She still had plenty of times before she had to head to school until her dreaded assembly. And she had to know what was happening. The dog crashed on the sofa next to her as she worked. Jazz searched for images first. She wanted to find a photo of Edith, the girl. What was her second name? It took Jazz a few seconds to remember. Then her heart stopped. Sykes. That was her name. Edith Sykes. Is that really what she'd said? Jazz looked out at the road sign to her street. Edith Sykes Drive. She swallowed. Everything was starting to feel like a dream again, but no, this wasn't Alice in Wonderland. It was Jasminder in Leeds, and it was real. It had happened, hadn't it? The few years since they'd lived here, Jazz had never wondered why her road was called Edith Sykes Drive, or even who Edith Sykes was. The first thing, now she stared at her computer, wide-eyed, and typed the words Edith Sykes. The first thing she found was a blog by someone called Louise Birch, who worked at Leeds Local History Library. It was called Remembering the Barnbow Tragedy. Jazz read on and could hardly believe the words in front of her. There had been a factory right here where she lived over 100 years ago. Here. Where her estate was and in the fields beyond. The factory had made shells for the First World War. Shells was a name for bombs that were fired at the enemy. And, Jazz read, in 1916 there had been an explosion in the factory because one of the shells that the Barnbow Lasses had been filling with explosives had gone off. 35 women had been killed. 35. Jazz put her hand to her mouth. She felt sick, dizzy. What was this? Jazz's mind flashed back to what she had seen when she was walking the dog, what she had witnessed. She shuddered. She never wanted to see anything like that again, and started to wonder why this girl had come from nowhere and made her watch it. Needing answers, Jazz scrolled down and found a list of names. She knew what she had found, and she could feel her heart hammering as she studied the list. Maggie Barker, Olive Yates, Ethel Jackson. Names Jazz saw every day, the names of her streets on the estate, from the list of women who had died making shells for the First World War. And then towards the end of the list, this. Edith Sykes of Leeds died, aged 15. Edith's older sister Agnes also worked in Barnbow's room 42, but the night of the explosion, Agnes was home sick with flu. Edith was injured in the explosion and taken to Leeds Infirmary, where she died several weeks later. It's possible Edith lied about her age to work at Barnbow, as birth records indicate she was 15 at the time of her death. 15. Edith Sykes hadn't even been a woman. She'd been a girl only 2 years older than Jazz. Jazz frowned. She understood now what was happening. Edith Sykes was haunting her. Jazz swallowed, desperate to know more. She read on. Due to government censorship and fears over morale, the explosion and location of Barnbow were kept out of the national press, and the obituaries of the women who died carried ambiguous references to killed by accident or died suddenly. Jazz was horrified. So, even after Edith had been killed, her family had not been able to say she had died making bombs to help win the war. No one had been allowed to remember her and what she'd done. How would that have felt? No wonder she was a ghost, Jazz thought. She had unfinished business. Jazz longed to speak to Edith Sykes again. She looked out at the street to see if she was there at the top of the road, waiting like she had been that morning. But the street light she'd been under was off, and there was no trace of Edith Sykes now, other than a street sign bearing her name. "I need to see you again," Jazz muttered, scrolling through the pages of information about the Barnbow Lasses, learning more and more. "Where are you?" she said. And then, as she talked to herself, a photograph appeared on screen. Jazz recognised it immediately. The memorial in the park just up the road. She had walked past it thousands of times, going to play tennis or football or to have a picnic. Her mum even told her about it, that the memorial was there to remember the Barnbow Lasses. How could she have forgotten that? Jazz stood up. "Come on," she said to the dog. "Walk." The dog eyed Jazz, unmoving. "You're coming," Jazz said firmly, glancing at the clock. 7:30, an hour before school. We still have time," she told the dog. Manston Lane was busy with cars and bikes and lorries and buses, and with children walking to school in different coloured uniforms when Jazz arrived at the park. The memorial was right next to the main gate. Jazz stopped and read the words written on a large piece of stone. "The Barnbow Lasses, their courage and sacrifice will not be forgotten." Courage. Sacrifice. Jazz nodded. That was right. The memorial said it. And even though she had lived here for years and even been told about the Barnbow Lasses, she had forgotten them. These women, just like everyone walking to school or driving to work, was forgetting them. And on today of all days, November the 11th, Remembrance Day, when loads of them would stop and remember soldiers and airmen and sailors at 11 a.m. in silence. But would they remember the Barnbow Lasses too? Jazz understood the words courage and sacrifice that were etched in front of her were important for the soldiers in her assembly today. They had all shown huge courage. They had sacrificed their freedom, even their lives. But she knew that the women from Barnbow had done the same. What Jazz had seen in those sheds came back to her. Those terrible scenes, women dead and dying, screaming out in pain, appalling visions she would never forget. And now Jazz felt like she had shown no courage, because when Edith Sykes had asked her to witness the scenes in room 42, she'd run away, even after Edith had asked her directly for help. Jazz felt moisture on her face. It wasn't raining. She turned to walk away, glancing back to see if the ghost of Edith Sykes was there, where she had hoped to see her, hoping to say she was sorry, that she wanted to help, but she was not. Jazz heard a church bell chiming 8 times. 8 o'clock already. She needed to get the dog home and then on to school. 2.5 hours later, Jazz stood facing the rest of her year group. 209 year 8s sat watching her. In her hands were the notes about her project about the soldiers in the trenches, the one that she'd kept her awake half the night. But in her mind, she was still reeling from what she had seen and read that morning. She longed to see Edith Sykes again at the memorial. Why had she not been there? "Go on, Jazz," Mrs. Milner, her head of year, urged. Jazz nodded, swallowed, looked at her notes, and opened her mouth to speak about the soldiers. And then she noticed that she was not alone at the front of the assembly, that someone was standing alongside her. Jazz looked into the eyes of the other person who was with her. It was then that she made a decision to take a risk, to show a tiny bit of courage herself.